समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to The Print. This is Bidisha and you're watching Economics. Today we are talking about a kite. Last week, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal stood before the Board of Trade in New Delhi and said India is quote unquote on track for $1 trillion in exports this year. And he used this lovely image. He said, when you fly a kite, you have to hold it tight. Now, this is a nice line, but here's the thing about kites. What actually keeps them in the air isn't the person holding the string. It's the wind, the tension, and 100 tiny adjustments you can't see from the ground. And on the very same day Minister Goyal gave that speech, the Finance Ministry issued something else: the rules of origin for the India-UK trade agreement. The paperwork that decides which Indian exporters actually get the tax breaks that agreement promises starting 15th of July. So today, I want to walk you through why that boring administrative document might matter more to India's trillion-dollar dream than any summit or any signing ceremony. In this explainer, we are going to unpack free trade agreements, trade deficits, tariffs, and something called utilization rate, all of them in simple terms. Now let's start with the basics. What exactly is this free trade agreement? Because the term FTA gets thrown around a lot. A free trade agreement or FTA is simply a deal between two countries or a country and a bloc where both sides agree to lower or scrap the taxes they charge on each other's goods at the border. Those border taxes are called tariffs. Normally, if a British shoe company wants to sell shoes in India or an Indian textile company wants to sell shirts in Britain, the importing country charges a tariff, a percentage tax on the value of the goods. An FTA is essentially both countries agreeing that let's remove or reduce that tax for each other so trade flows more easily. This isn't new for India. In fact, our relationship with FTAs goes back 2 decades. And the numbers show real commitment. According to the government's own Niti Aayog, in its Trade Watch quarterly report, the share of India's total trade that happens with FTA partner countries has grown from just 4.6% in 2006 to a striking 28.8% in 2024. Look at this chart on your screen for a second. That's not a small shift, that's nearly a 7-fold jump in less than 20 years. India has bet heavily that opening up through these agreements is the right long-term strategy. And broadly, that bet has paid dividends in market access and diplomatic goodwill. But, and this is the part that got my attention, that very same Niti Aayog report has a second number buried in it that tells a very different, more immediate story. In the most recent quarter, India's exports to its FTA partners actually fell by 7% year on year, down to $40.26 billion. Meanwhile, imports from those same partners rose by 6% to $70.98 billion, so exports down, imports up, in the very partnerships that were supposed to boost our exports. Now that's the tension I want you to hold in your mind as we go forward. Now, one bad quarter doesn't really prove anything on its own. quarterly trade numbers bounce around for all sorts of reasons: currency movements, one-off shipments, global demand cycles. So the real question is, does this match a longer pattern? To answer that, let's look at India's three oldest big FTAs. With ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, signed in 2010, with Japan in 2011, and with South Korea also in 2010. Now, these have been running long enough now that we can properly compare the before and after. Here's what the chart on your screen shows, comparing the years just before these agreements, 2007 to 2009, with the recent period of 2023 to 2025. India's exports to ASEAN did grow by 104%. Exports to Japan grew 48%. Exports to South Korea grew 63%. On the export side alone, that sounds like a success story. But here's the concept I want to explain properly here: the trade deficit. A trade deficit is simply the gap between what a country imports and what it exports. If you're importing more than you're exporting from a particular partner, you're running a deficit with them. Now, it's not automatically a bad thing. No economy needs to balance every single bilateral relationship, but it tells you who's benefiting more from a given trade corridor. And in all three of these FTAs, imports grew faster than exports. So much faster that the trade deficit, that gap, expanded by 381% with ASEAN, 318% with Japan, and 268% with South Korea over that same period. Compare that to how India's deficit grew with the rest of the world, countries we don't have FTAs with. That figure was 142%. Now, this comparison against non-FTA countries is the crucial bit. It isolates what the agreements themselves did, separate from global trends. And it's not just an academic observation. This is the exact concern that led India back in 2019 to walk away from the RCEP negotiations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a mega trade bloc, citing worries about very similar deficit patterns with some of the same countries. To put today's numbers on this, India's deficit under the Korea Agreement alone reached roughly $15.2 billion in the 2025 financial year. With ASEAN, it is estimated between $43 and $46 billion in the 2024 financial year. Now, these are large, live numbers. They're not history. So here's the puzzle. If tariffs come down on both sides, shouldn't exports rise roughly equally for both countries? Why does India seem to benefit less from its own trade agreements? To answer this, I would like to introduce you to a term you'll hear more and more: the utilization rate. This is the percentage of goods that are eligible for the FTA discount that actually use it. Now, just because your product qualifies for a lower tariff does not mean the exporter bothers to claim it, because claiming it requires proving where the good was made, filling out a certificate of origin, and often absorbing extra compliance cost. And this chart on your screen right now honestly is the heart of the whole story. According to the GTRI, the Global Trade Research Initiative, in its FTA Report Card 2026, only about 20 to 30% of India's eligible exports actually use the FTA preference to claim a lower tariff abroad. Meanwhile, foreign exporters selling into India use their preference at a 60 to 70% rate. Now, the question is, why the gap? Two reasons, and they're both structural, none of them are accidental. First, many of India's FTA partner countries already had fairly low tariffs before the agreement. So an Indian exporter often gains very little by going through the paperwork to claim a discount that was small to begin with in the first place. Second, foreign exporters coming into India face an average tariff of 12.6%. a much bigger price. So for them, filling out the origin paperwork is clearly worth the effort. In other words, the incentive to do the paperwork is lopsided in favor of the foreign exporter, not the Indian one. That's the quote-unquote paperwork tax. Not a tax in the literal sense, but a compliance burden that quietly determines who actually captures the benefit of this agreement. Now here's some genuinely good news, and it's worth spending time on because CETA, the India-UK Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, doesn't automatically repeat this pattern. It has real specific openings for India. The UK maintains some fairly high tariffs, what we call tariff peaks, in labour-intensive sectors that matter enormously for Indian jobs. Roughly 8 to 12% on textiles and clothing and 4 to 8% on footwear and leather goods. Now these are sectors where a genuine discount is on the table. Compare that to engineering goods and automotive components which already entered the UK at close to zero tariff, meaning CETA doesn't change much for those exporters either way. Here's the catch though, and it's the same paperwork problem in a slightly different costume. The sectors that stand to gain the most from CETA, textiles and footwear, are dominated by small and medium exporters, the ones with the least capacity to handle certification costs and compliance paperwork. Meanwhile, the sectors that are better resourced to handle paperwork, for instance engineering, autos, they don't have much financial incentive to bother because their tariffs were already low. So the opportunity is real, but it's sitting exactly where the capacity to grab it is the weakest. Now that's not a flaw in the agreement itself, it's a solvable operational gap, and it's exactly the kind of gap that smart implementation can close. Now the question is, what could actually fix this? This is where I think the conversation should go next, and the GTRI report is genuinely constructive here. It doesn't just flag the problem, it offers a roadmap. 3 recommendations stand out for me. 1. An FTA impact monitoring authority, a dedicated body to track sector by sector who's actually using these agreements and who isn't, so policy can respond in real time instead of after the fact. Second, mutual recognition of UK and Indian testing and certification standards, so an Indian exporter doesn't have to get the same product tested twice, once in each country. Third, simplified compliance specifically designed for smaller exporters, the ones this deal is theoretically meant to help the most. Now, none of these have been implemented in previous FTA reviews. That's not a criticism of any one agreement, it's a consistent fixable gap across India's trade architecture, and CETA gives us a fresh chance to close it. Minister Piyush Goyal is right that this requires careful hands-on management. That part of the metaphor on the kite holds up completely. But the string that determines whether this kite flies isn't a high-level meeting or a headline target. It's whether an Indian Rules of Origin certificate gets filled in correctly by a small exporter who has never had to do this kind of paperwork before. So here's your one number to track going forward. Watch whether CETA's utilization rate, that percentage of eligible exporters actually claiming the benefit, clearly exceeds India's historical 20 to 30% range over the next 2 to 3 quarters after the 15th of July. Now, if it does, that tells us that something real has changed. If it doesn't, the $1 trillion target will need more than a good metaphor to get there. That's the honest, hopeful way to watch this space, not as a verdict already delivered, but as a test that's about to begin. Thank you for watching.